What was the world like in 100 BC? So this is part of my art history course that's just a 101 all the way across art history, looking at some really big issues of art across time. But you could watch this as a standalone. Why you would want to, I have no idea. So today we're going to talk about the world in 100 BC. The previous episode had given you a comparison of Greece and Rome, so we're sort of jumping on that and we're looking at it. The episode before that, there was a couple episodes about ancient art. And so when we look at the world in 100 BC, we see the rise in empires. We see the rise in big groups of people being under the same control of a government. In the prehistory, so like 500 BC, 1000 BC, 2000 BC, you see throughout the world a very different kind of structure. You see a structure where people are moving into farming. So this is from 500. There, a lot of agrarian societies, but what's happening is at 1000 you had agrarian societies and everybody's culture was very much tied to their village. Here you see a collective of collective ideas. So they have art making that goes across a huge span of space, but the governments are still sort of separate. By 100 BC, pretty much all of these colors are empires. So in the last episode, two episodes we talked about, say, like ancient Egypt or the Babylonians, that there are some empires. Now that whole thing has well expanded by 100 BC. And we had talked about Rome. At this time in Rome, we're still in a republic. They have a lot more land than they had before. There's 1 million people living in the city of Rome, and Julius Caesar is born. But since we've already talked about Rome and there's lots of videos, what else is happening in the world? And this episode is really just to give you that kind of benchmarking. So you get a cross-global, cross-cultural sort of snapshot of 100 in art making. So the Romans are making art to celebrate what they're doing, which is basically expanding. They're still a republic. The most powerful empire in 100 CE would be the Han Dynasty. So in China, you have Qing Shi Huangdi, who is the first emperor. That's the emperor of Qin. It's the dynasty before that. So the first emperor's tomb, all of those tomb guardians, that's the emperor before this. He was not very well liked. The Han Dynasty, which begins in 206 BC, on the other hand, has a lot more success. They have basically the same footprint to start as the Qin emperor, but they really are interested in a lot more kind of culture and government making and order. This is when you see like the rise of paper, the rise of, they make stirrups and they do all sorts of very smart things basically to grow all kinds of cultural growth. So building, art making, textiles, all of these things are flourishing under the Han Dynasty. Part of this is because they've taken horse culture from the Central Asian steppes. We're going to talk about those people in a little bit. But it's also because there is more people who have wealth. They are also basically exporting a lot of stuff. This is the beginning of the Silk Route, and they are just trading silk. They are wealthy beyond anybody else in the world's imaginations, and so they're also building a lot of tombs. Part of the reason they're building tombs is because they're Confucian, and so they believe in this sort of order of revering your ancestors. So tomb culture becomes really important. So what you should see is it's an organized empire, an empire that wants to build bigger, and it's an empire that has a faith that sort of pushes it. And in this case, the faith is Confucianism. And in many ways, faith and empire continue throughout this period. In India, you see many different empires. I'm just going to pick one. The Shunga are in what is now northwest India, and northeast India, and they are really becoming Buddhist. Now, in Indian history, you might think of Maurya Empire, the one afterwards, as being the big Buddhist empire, which is true, but the Shunga are Buddhists, and so they do a lot of Buddhist building. And what they're actually really interested in is stabilizing their land. So they're very good at basically building for faith, and then two, creating a stable and wealthy community. And so you see the rise in really beautifully made jewelry. If you see jewelry in a culture, if you see anything gold, that means that they're doing pretty well, right? Because they have to have the resources to make it, they have to have somebody who's willing to pay for it, they have to have the structure to basically, plan for it. So this is a sign of a pretty organized society. So we've now done the we've done the Han Dynasty, we've done the Shunga Dynasty. I'm going to skip over things like over here the Parthians, just because I want to kind of give you a sense of like the global world in this short video. The next one you should think about are the Scythians. So if the Han Dynasty and the Shunga Dynasty are fairly organized and rational, have a sort of an organized cultural religion, the Scythians are really like marauding steppe warriors. So the Scythians are really the beginning of horse culture, and they have some of the finest gold that has ever been made. They also had a habit of like scalping their enemies and, for example, using them as bags. They were very, very culturally, I would say almost gruesome. They had amazing culture, but it was a very adversarial culture. When we think of the art making, though, that kind of gold work remains some of the most amazing. And if you notice, their gold and this gold are both a very, very orange gold. It's because both are working with basically pure gold, 22, 24 karat gold. So they're not skimping on the natural resources there. Part of the reason is because both are using gold in only the highest and highest of arts. The other Scythian art that you should see, and we haven't talked about in Han Dynasty, even though I showed some of it and I mentioned it quickly, throughout this, one of the other things these three civilizations have is textiles. So the Scythians' big money maker is that they're in the middle of the Silk Route, right? So like you have to go through them to pass the silk over to the Romans. And in India, they have amazing textile communities that are cropping up. And textiles in China, of course, with silk, textiles is supporting all of those societies. So all the gold that you saw is because they had the wealth of textiles. Even though now in our society, gold would be the wealthy thing, then you should think textiles were the wealthy thing, because they took a long time. They took a lot of resources to create them. Okay, so I've given you kind of a snapshot over here. Now let's look down here. So in Africa, you have a number of different kinds of communities. Throughout Africa, you have lots of smaller communities that have remained agrarian, because remember, empire building isn't necessarily the logical next step after you're agrarian. You can live like that and be incredibly happy. Empire is one way human beings decide to move from an agrarian society. But in Africa, the most powerful empire probably, I mean, there's a, sort of a toss-up, but I would say probably would be the Kush dynasty, and the Kush people were in what is now Sudan. And so in Sudan today, there are more pyramids than anywhere in the world. So the Kush empire was long-lived from like 800 to from 800 BC, well into this period. And for a period of time, they also moved north and they took over ancient Egypt. Now that's it's a few hundred years before 100 BC, but still, they still had a lot of wealth and power. Okay, so we've looked at the empires of Asia, Africa, and Europe. What about the rest of the world? So in the rest of the world, one of the challenges we have is colonialism. Now, colonialism did not exist in the way we think of it now in 100 BC. But what did happen is, in the era of colonialism, we ended up with so much kind of destruction of cultural artifacts, one, and two, cultural artifacts were often misdated. So I want just to say very clearly that there was lots happening here, but we have an incomplete record. Second, when we look at the societies that are in the places where you see no empire, it's not saying there's no people. It's also a time when you see basically these communities remain somewhat agrarian, but also not really interested in empire building. So when you're not building an empire, you are making art for yourself and for your community. So a lot of the art might be functional, like baskets or ceramic containers to cook, or it's things to remember your own people for yourself. And that's really important because when we look at African art from this period, Australian art from this period, North American and South American art, a lot of it is a lot more driven by symbols because if you're doing something and everybody is in that society, they understand the symbols. So you can really sort of trick out the symbols and make it visually very interesting and appealing without having to make it narrative because everyone knows the story. It's not like the Romans who were having to tell the Roman story to people who are in a different society. So you see a lot of symbolism. But the final thing you heard me say is basketry and ceramics. A lot of their art was art that was meant to survive for now. They didn't have the same desire for empire, and empire often also requires the desire for things that are very permanent, right? Because you perceive that you should be important for all of eternity. Think of the ancient Egyptians. So with that in mind, a lot of the material culture record is just different in these places. Now, that said, I think one of the things you want to see, and we'll talk about in future episodes, are the art of the Wari in South America. And also to look at some of the to look at some of the amazing materials that are coming out of Africa around that time. So those will be two different future episodes. Now, before we end, I want to kind of give you where we're going next. We will then talk in the next episode about 100 AD. So we're going to see what happens in this time period, and of course, in the middle, how the world changes by 100 AD. So to summarize, 100 BC, we're seeing kind of a split in the world. There are people who are not empire building, they're creating things that are really for today and for their own communities. Then we have empire building societies. And empire building societies, or people who want to take over grand swaths of land, are powered by this desire to take over that land and then build on that land and tell their stories. These are also often communities that have some sort of desire in the afterlife. So they're tomb builders, they're grave builders. They also are making a lot of their money off of art. So we see, for example, in Han, China, they're making a lot of money off of silk. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Like, follow, subscribe, share, tell a friend.